Police dog breaks into hospital to save a baby. What happened next left? Everyone in tears. Mercy General Hospital in Chicago bustled with the quiet urgency of the night shift. The halls were filled with hushed voices, the steady beeping of heart monitors, and the rhythmic sound of rolling gurneys. In the neonatal intensive care unit, the battle for life was waged in silence, each breath fragile, each heartbeat a whisper. Among the smallest warriors was baby Ethan, a premature infant struggling to hold on to life. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven movements, the ventilator forcing air into his underdeveloped lungs. The doctors had done everything they could: medicine, machines, expert hands, and still the prognosis was grim. Outside the NICU, Nurse Amelia Walker stood near the viewing window, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fragile infant inside the incubator. She had been a nurse for almost 10 years, had seen her share of miracles and heartbreaks, but this case weighed on her heart. Ethan's mother had passed away during childbirth, and his father, Daniel, a decorated police officer, lay in a coma just 2 floors away, his body broken from the car accident that had taken his wife. Ethan was alone, and the thought haunted Amelia more than she cared to admit. She exhaled softly, rubbing her tired eyes before turning to check the monitors when a commotion erupted from the far end of the hallway. The hospital entrance doors had swung open violently, the cold Chicago air sweeping through the lobby as a blur of dark fur darted past security. A uniformed guard shouted, sprinting after the intruder. "What the hell?" Amelia barely had time to react before she saw it. A dog, not just any dog, large, muscular, a German shepherd with sharp amber eyes, ears pricked forward with determination. He moved with precision, his powerful paws striking the tile floor with purpose. He was making a beeline for the NICU. "Hey, stop that dog!" a security officer yelled, but the shepherd was too fast. Nurses and doctors jumped back as he raced through the corridor, dodging carts and IV stands, his breath visible in the sterile air. The hospital, a place of order and structure, had suddenly been thrown into chaos by this determined intruder. Amelia's heart pounded as the dog skidded to a stop in front of the NICU door. His paws slid for half a second before he righted himself, turned sharply and sat, staring through the glass panel. The security guard finally caught up, panting. "What in God's name is going on?" The name on his badge read Torres, and he looked thoroughly bewildered. Amelia took an instinctive step forward, locking eyes with the animal. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't lost or confused. He was focused. There was an intelligence in his eyes, something almost human. He wasn't just any dog. He was here for a reason. "Who let him in?" one of the nurses asked. "I have no idea," Torres huffed. "Came through the doors like he owned the place. Didn't even hesitate." Amelia's pulse quickened. The dog was staring straight at Ethan. "Someone check his tags," she said. Torres approached cautiously, but the dog didn't move, didn't flinch. Just let him reach out. The guard flipped over the worn leather collar, his brows furrowing. "Leo," he read. The moment the name left his mouth, something clicked in Amelia's mind. Leo. She knew that name. It was in Daniel's medical records. Leo was Daniel's former K-9 partner. Before the accident, Daniel had been an officer in the Chicago Police Department's K-9 unit. His partner had been a German shepherd named Leo. After years of service together, Leo had retired early due to an injury, and Daniel had adopted him. A shiver ran down Amelia's spine. "He's not just any dog," she whispered. "He's Ethan's dad's partner." Torres turned to her in shock. "Wait, you mean this dog?" "Yes, he belonged to Officer Daniel Carter." A heavy silence settled over them. They all knew Daniel's story, knew about the accident, about the baby fighting for his life. But how had Leo known? How had he found his way to the hospital? Here now. "This dog just broke into a hospital," Torres said slowly. "For what? To sit here and look at a baby?" No one had an answer. But as Amelia turned back to the NICU window, she felt an odd sense of certainty. Leo was here for Ethan. "Let me call Dr. Lucas," Amelia said, already moving toward the nurse's station. Dr. Lucas was the head of pediatrics and the only person she trusted to make sense of this situation. Meanwhile, Leo hadn't moved an inch. He sat, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan's tiny, struggling form. Amelia reached for the phone, dialing quickly. The ringing echoed in her ear before a groggy voice answered. Lucas, the doctor grumbled, clearly woken from sleep. Doctor, Lucas, it's Amelia. You need to come to the NICU. Now. What's going on? You wouldn't believe me if I told you, she said. By the time Dr. Lucas arrived, still shrugging into his white coat, the tension in the hallway had thickened. Leo was still there, unmoving. Lucas frowned, taking in the scene. That's the dog? Yes, Amelia confirmed. He's been sitting there since he got in. He's not budging. Lucas sighed, rubbing his temple. Amelia, I know you have a soft spot for cases like this, but we can't have a dog running around the hospital. NICU is sterile, and look at Ethan's monitors. Lucas paused. His gaze flickered toward the incubator. Then his expression changed. The lines on the screen, once erratic, were stabilizing. Ethan's oxygen levels were rising. His tiny body, once fighting for every breath, seemed stronger. That, Lucas hesitated. That doesn't make sense. It started the second Leo got here, Amelia said softly. Silence fell over them. Leo remained still, his ears flicking slightly at the sound of the machines, his gaze never leaving Ethan. There was no explanation for it, none that medicine could provide at least. Torres broke the silence. So, what do we do? Lucas exhaled, glancing between Amelia and the monitors. Then he made a decision. We let him stay. No one argued, because at that moment it didn't matter how or why Leo had come. All that mattered was that baby Ethan was getting stronger. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the neonatal intensive care unit, a mechanical lullaby that echoed through the sterile, white walls. Nurse Amelia Walker watched the monitors carefully, her pulse mirroring the steady rise and fall of Ethan's tiny chest. Just an hour ago, the baby's vitals had been dangerously unstable, his oxygen levels fluctuating wildly despite the ventilator's best efforts. But now something had changed, something unexplainable. Ever since Leo arrived, sitting vigilantly outside the NICU window, Ethan's body seemed to be responding in ways no one could rationalize. His oxygen saturation had climbed steadily, and his heart rate had stabilized. The medical team had done nothing different, yet the improvement was undeniable. Dr. Lucas, normally a man of science and reason, stood in quiet contemplation beside Amelia, his sharp eyes flickering between the German Shepherd and the monitors. I don't know what to make of this, he murmured, rubbing his jaw. It could be coincidence, but his voice trailed off as Leo, sitting motionless just outside the glass, let out a low whine, his ears twitching toward the baby. Amelia's gaze softened. She wasn't one for superstition, but she had been in this hospital long enough to know that not everything could be explained by medicine alone. Coincidence or not, Ethan's getting stronger, she said, and that dog is the only thing that's changed. Dr. Lucas exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. We can't keep a dog in the hospital, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Amelia raised an eyebrow. Why not? We have therapy dogs visit patients all the time. Lucas shot her a dry look. Yes, but those therapy dogs don't break in on their own in the middle of the night and park themselves outside a critical patient's window. Still, he didn't move to have Leo removed. If anything, he seemed just as mesmerized by the situation as everyone else. A sudden buzz crackled through Amelia's radio, breaking the silence. Walker, you there? She grabbed the device from her pocket, pressing the button. Yeah, go ahead. Security needs you on the 4th floor, came the reply. There's some kind of issue in room 417. Amelia frowned. That was the trauma ward. And room 417? She felt her stomach drop. That was Daniel Carter's room. Without hesitation, she turned on her heel. I have to go. Dr. Lucas gave her a questioning look, but she didn't stop to explain. She knew Leo wouldn't move from his spot, and Ethan's vitals were stable for now. Whatever was happening upstairs, she had a feeling it was just as important. The elevator ride felt agonizingly slow, each passing second pressing against her chest like a weight. When the doors finally slid open onto the trauma ward, she was met with the sight of 2 security guards standing outside Daniel Carter's room, their postures tense. One of the guards, a younger man named Ramos, turned at her approach. We were checking the night rounds when we noticed something strange, he said. Amelia's heart pounded. What kind of strange? The second guard, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, crossed his arms. The patient's been in a coma for weeks, but just now we heard movement. Amelia's breath caught. Movement? That wasn't possible. Daniel Carter had been completely unresponsive since the accident. She pushed past the guards, her fingers trembling as she reached for the door handle. Slowly, she eased the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the soft blue glow of the monitors. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the space, unchanged. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, she saw it. The slight twitch of fingers. Barely noticeable, but undeniably there. She froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Daniel?" she whispered. No response. But then his fingers moved again. A slow, deliberate flick. The first sign of life beyond the machines in weeks. Amelia rushed to the bedside, her medical instincts kicking in. She checked his pupils, noted the slight fluttering of his eyelids. His breathing remained steady, his vitals unchanged. But something was shifting. He was trying to wake up. Her mind raced. Patients in long-term comas sometimes had involuntary muscle spasms, but this felt different, as if he was responding to something, as if he was fighting his way back. And then, without warning, a sound drifted up from below. A sound so faint, yet so eerily present, that Amelia felt chills run down her spine. It was a low whimper, a dog's whimper. Leo. She turned sharply toward the window, her heart thudding. The NICU was 2 floors below, but somehow, impossibly, she could hear him. And so could Daniel. His fingers twitched again, this time curling slightly as if trying to grasp something unseen. Amelia sucked in a breath. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. She bolted for the door, practically sprinting back to the elevator. The guards called after her, but she barely heard them. She needed to get back downstairs. She needed to see if Ethan's condition was still improving. If this was all connected, if Leo was somehow the link between father and son, she had to know. When she burst back into the NICU hallway, breathless, Leo was exactly where she had left him, still staring into the unit, still fixated on the fragile baby fighting for his life. But something was different. The monitors beside Ethan's incubator were blinking in a steady, strong rhythm. The tiny, fragile heartbeat was no longer struggling. It was thriving. Amelia pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the overwhelming weight of something larger than herself unfolding before her eyes. She turned to Doctor Lucas, who was still studying the scene with furrowed brows, his logical mind at war with the impossible. "You're seeing this, right?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Lucas nodded slowly. "I'm seeing it." She hesitated for a moment before making the choice that had already formed in her heart. "I need to bring Leo to Daniel." Lucas snapped his gaze to her. "Are you out of your mind?" "Maybe," Amelia admitted, "but something is happening, and I refuse to ignore it. That dog broke into this hospital for a reason. Ethan is getting stronger, and now Daniel is responding too. If Leo is the missing piece, we owe it to them to find out." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Hospital administration is going to lose their minds over this." "Then they can write me up later," Amelia said firmly. "Right now, we have a chance to bring a man back to his son. I won't let that slip away." For a long moment, Lucas studied her, the weight of the decision pressing between them. Then finally he sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "But if anyone asks, this was your idea." Amelia turned to Leo, her heart pounding. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Let's go wake him up." Leo didn't hesitate. He stood, shook out his fur, and followed her without a sound. The sound of Amelia's footsteps echoed down the sterile hospital corridor as she led Leo toward the elevator. The German shepherd walked beside her, his movements fluid and purposeful, as though he understood exactly where they were going and why. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting sharp reflections on the polished floor. The hospital's night staff eyed them warily as they passed, but no one stopped them. Whether it was out of shock, curiosity, or some unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was unfolding, Amelia wasn't sure. All she knew was that she had never felt more certain of anything in her life. She pressed the button for the 4th floor, her pulse quickening as the elevator doors slid open and she and Leo stepped inside. The doors closed, enclosing them in a silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery. Amelia glanced down at Leo, who sat patiently at her side, ears pricked forward, amber eyes sharp. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered. The dog didn't respond, but he didn't need to. His presence was answer enough. The elevator jolted to a stop, and as the doors opened, the fourth floor greeted them with the quiet hum of late-night activity. The trauma ward had always carried a different energy than the rest of the hospital, an odd mix of urgency and stillness, of battles fought in the deep hours of the night. But tonight, the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Amelia stepped out, feeling the weight of every breath as she approached room 417. The two security guards still stood outside, their expressions wary, but their eyes widened when they saw the dog at her side. "Walker, what the hell?" Ramos began, but Amelia held up a hand. "Trust me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Just let him in." The older guard hesitated, glancing at the German shepherd. There was something in the way Leo held himself, something commanding yet gentle, something that made even the skeptical pause. After a long moment, the guard sighed and stepped aside. "Whatever this is, I hope you know what you're doing." Amelia pushed the door open, her heart thudding as she and Leo stepped into the dimly lit hospital room. The air smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of lingering cologne, the kind of scent that still clung to a person even after weeks of immobility. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor provided a steady background noise, a constant reminder that though Daniel Carter had not yet woken, he was still here, still fighting. Leo's posture shifted the moment they entered. His ears perked higher, his body tensed, and then, without hesitation, he moved. He walked to the side of the hospital bed with deliberate, slow steps, his gaze locked onto the man lying unconscious beneath the thin white sheets. The transformation in the dog was immediate. Gone was the sharp focus of an officer's trained companion. In its place was something softer, something desperate. Leo let out a low, aching whimper, his nose pressing gently against Daniel's limp hand. Amelia sucked in a breath. She had never seen an animal express such raw emotion, such longing. Leo nudged Daniel's fingers again, then sat beside the bed, his body pressed close as if he could will the man awake through sheer force of devotion. The moment stretched impossibly long, a fragile silence settling over the room. Then it happened. A twitch. Daniel's fingers moved, small and uncertain at first, then stronger, as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The heart monitor's beeping changed slightly, a shift in rhythm so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed if Amelia hadn't been watching for it. She felt her breath hitch in her throat as she moved closer, her hand hovering near the call button for the doctors. But something inside her told her to wait, to let this moment play out. Leo let out another soft whine and gently licked Daniel's fingers. And this time, there was no mistaking it. The fingers curled, not involuntarily, but deliberately. A gasp escaped Amelia before she could stop it. "Daniel," she whispered, leaning in. "Can you hear me?" The silence stretched, the only response the continued beeping of the machines. But then, after what felt like an eternity, his eyelids fluttered. Not just the random flickers of deep unconsciousness, but the slow, struggling motion of a man trying to wake up. Amelia reached out, her fingers brushing lightly over his wrist. "You're not alone," she whispered. "Leo's here." The name seemed to have weight, pressing into the space between them. And then, like a thread being pulled through the darkness, Daniel's breathing changed. It deepened, became more aware. A small sound escaped his lips, barely more than a breath, but it was there. Amelia's heart pounded. She turned toward the doorway, ready to call for help, but before she could move, a raspy whisper filled the air. "Leo!" The voice was weak, raw from disuse, but it was real. It was him. Leo immediately responded, his tail thumping once against the floor, his nose pressing insistently into Daniel's hand. And then, with what looked like every ounce of strength he had, Daniel's fingers curled around the fur of his old partner. Amelia barely registered the sound of her own sharp inhale, her vision blurring slightly as she reached for the intercom. "I need a doctor in room 417, she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming wave of emotion crashing over her. "Now." The hospital's response was immediate. Within moments, the door burst open and Dr. Lucas rushed inside, followed by two nurses. The sudden flood of activity sent Leo shifting slightly, his head lifting to watch as the medical team descended upon Daniel. Lucas barely spared Amelia a glance as he moved to the bedside, checking vitals, shining a light into Daniel's now half-open eyes. "Daniel," he said firmly, "can you hear me?" Daniel's mouth parted slightly, his lips dry and cracked. It took visible effort, but then slowly he gave the smallest nod. The nurses exchanged glances, their hands moving with swift efficiency as they adjusted his IV, checked his reflexes. Lucas straightened, his expression a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. "His neurological response is returning," he murmured. "This shouldn't be possible this fast." Amelia knew exactly what he meant. Patients who had been in comas for weeks, especially after severe trauma, didn't just wake up like this. It was gradual, often agonizingly slow. But Daniel wasn't just responding, he was aware. Lucas turned to Amelia, his voice low. "What the hell did you do?" She swallowed hard, glancing down at the German shepherd still stationed beside the bed. "It wasn't me," she said quietly. "It was him." Lucas followed her gaze to Leo, watching as the dog kept his head pressed close to Daniel's side, his eyes never leaving his partner. The doctor let out a slow breath. "You know the administration is going to want an explanation for this?" Amelia nodded. "I'll give them one," she said. "But first, I think we need to let them have their moment." And so, as the medical team worked and the hospital buzzed with newfound hope, Amelia stood back and watched the impossible unfold. Because against all odds, against science and reason, Daniel Carter was waking up, and the first thing he had reached for, the first thing he had remembered, was Leo. The hospital hummed with the kind of restrained chaos that came only when something impossible had happened. Word had already begun to spread. Officer Daniel Carter had woken up after weeks in a coma, and it wasn't a breakthrough in medicine that had done it. It wasn't a new drug or a cutting-edge procedure. It was a dog. A retired police K-9 who had broken into Mercy General in the middle of the night, ignoring security, running straight for the one man who had been his partner, his family. And somehow, impossibly, Daniel had responded. Amelia stood just outside the room watching as the medical team worked, voices hushed but urgent as they checked Daniel's vitals, asked him questions, monitored his every reaction. He was still weak, his movements slow, but his eyes, his sharp, dark eyes, were open, tracking the people around him, grounding himself in reality. She had seen many patients wake up before, but this was different. There was no sluggish confusion, no blankness in his gaze. He wasn't trying to piece together his identity or his location. The first thing he had done was whisper Leo's name, and the first thing he had done with his hands was reach for the dog. Leo hadn't moved from his spot by the bedside. His large paws were pressed against the hospital floor, his body tense with focus, but his eyes remained locked onto Daniel, unwavering. He let out another soft whimper, nudging Daniel's arm where it lay weakly against the blanket. In response, Daniel's fingers curled slightly, brushing through the thick fur. A simple gesture, but one that sent a sharp, unexpected ache through Amelia's chest. Dr. Lucas was standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed as he ran through a series of neurological tests, each one meant to measure cognition, coordination, memory. "Daniel," he said carefully, "can you tell me where you are?" Daniel's lips parted, dry and cracked from weeks of disuse, but his voice was stronger than Amelia expected. "Hospital," he rasped. Lucas nodded. "Do you remember what happened?" A slow inhale. Then finally, "Car accident." Amelia watched as Lucas and the nurses exchanged brief glances, impressed but cautious. This kind of clarity wasn't common so soon after a coma, let alone after a traumatic injury like his. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. "And do you remember this dog?" Lucas asked, tilting his head toward Leo. Daniel's expression changed. The exhaustion in his features remained, but his eyes sharpened with something else. Something deeper, something old. His fingers twitched against Leo's fur again, a muscle memory from a life before this, before the accident. "Leo," he said softly, his voice hoarse but sure. Leo let out a small, relieved noise, pressing his nose closer. Amelia felt her throat tighten. Lucas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered, stepping back slightly. "Well, that answers that." Daniel's eyes flickered up toward him. "How long?" he asked, voice still raw. Lucas hesitated. 26 days, he finally said. "You've been in a coma for almost a month." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Daniel's expression. Not shock, not exactly. More like quiet resignation. His gaze dropped slightly as though he was searching for something. Amelia knew what he was looking for before he even asked. "The baby," he murmured. "Ethan." The room stilled. For the first time, Amelia felt the weight of what she would have to say next. Slowly, she stepped forward, resting her hand lightly on the railing of the bed. "He's alive," she said gently, "but it hasn't been easy." Daniel's gaze snapped to her, and she saw it then. The pain, the grief, the heavy weight of loss that came with knowing what had happened. He remembered the crash. He remembered his wife. "Is he okay?" Daniel asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Amelia hesitated. She could have softened the truth, made it easier to bear, but something about the way Daniel was looking at her made her want to be honest. "He was struggling," she admitted, "but something changed tonight. Since Leo came, he's getting stronger." Daniel blinked, his brows knitting slightly, as if trying to process it all. Amelia swallowed hard. "I know how it sounds, but I've been watching him all night. The second Leo showed up, Ethan's vitals improved. It's like he—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I don't know. It's like he knew." The words settled heavily in the space between them. Daniel turned his head slightly, looking back at Leo, who remained silent but steady at his side. He let out a slow, tired breath. "Of course he knew," he murmured. "He's always known." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Lucas cleared his throat, stepping back toward the monitors. "All right," he muttered. "If this night wasn't weird enough already, let's just add that to the list of things we can't explain." He checked Daniel's vitals again, frowning slightly. "Your recovery is already unusual," he admitted. "But if you're awake and lucid, that means your body is responding better than we expected. We'll need to run more tests, monitor your progress. But for now, I'll let you rest." Daniel barely nodded, already looking exhausted from the effort of staying conscious. Amelia hesitated for a moment longer before reaching for the call button. "I'll arrange for you to see Ethan," she said softly. Daniel's fingers clenched slightly against Leo's fur. His eyes met hers. "Thank you." She nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, she reached down, brushing her fingers against Leo's head. "And you," she murmured. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" Leo blinked up at her, and though he made no sound, she swore she saw something almost knowing in his expression. No, she thought. He wasn't going anywhere. And somehow, impossibly, she knew that as long as Leo was here, neither Daniel nor Ethan would be alone again. The hospital corridors were quieter now, the hum of activity settling into the hushed lull of the early morning hours. The chaos of the night had given way to a fragile calm, but Amelia could still feel the weight of everything that had unfolded. Daniel was awake. Ethan was improving. And somehow, impossibly, the dog that had forced his way into the hospital had been at the center of it all. She glanced down at Leo, his strong form still stationed beside Daniel's bed, unmoving, unwavering. He had refused to leave his partner's side, his body pressed close to the hospital bed, as though the simple act of being there was enough to tether Daniel to this world. Dr. Lucas had gone to arrange further tests, the nurses had finished their evaluations, and now it was just the three of them, Amelia, Daniel, and the dog who had defied every rule to be here. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but Daniel's breathing had slowed, exhaustion finally pressing down on him after the monumental effort of waking up. Amelia knew he needed rest, but there was still one thing left to do. She pulled out her hospital ID and swiped it against the NICU access panel. The doors unlocked with a soft click, and she stepped inside. The room was bathed in soft blue light, the rows of incubators humming gently, their machines the only sound in the otherwise silent space. Her steps were quiet as she made her way to the far corner where Ethan lay, his tiny body wrapped in warmth, his breathing steadier than before. The night shift nurse on duty glanced up as she approached. "How's he doing?" Amelia whispered. The nurse smiled, her expression touched with something that looked like wonder. "Better than expected," she said. "Honestly, it's like he just decided to fight harder." Amelia swallowed past the lump in her throat. He hadn't decided, not on his own. Someone had decided for him. Someone had come for him. She reached down, adjusting the blanket around the small infant. "His father is awake," she murmured. "I'm taking him to see him." The nurse's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what? Daniel Carter woke up?" Amelia nodded. "A few hours ago." The woman let out a slow breath. "You're serious? That's—" She shook her head, looking down at the baby. "That's incredible." It was, but Amelia didn't have time to sit with the miracle of it. Gently, carefully, she reached into the incubator and lifted Ethan into her arms, cradling him against her chest. He was so light, so impossibly small, but his tiny hand twitched slightly against her scrub top, as though he could sense the change in the air. She pressed a soft kiss to his forehead before turning back toward the door. "I'll bring him back soon," she promised. The walk back to Daniel's room felt heavier, like something monumental was pressing down on each step. She knew what this moment meant, knew the weight of it, the loss Daniel had suffered, the son he had never had the chance to hold, the wife who had died before she could tell him his family had grown. She stopped outside room 417, taking a slow breath before stepping inside. Daniel was still awake, though barely, his exhaustion evident in the way his body seemed to sink further into the bed. But when his gaze lifted and landed on the small bundle in Amelia's arms, something shifted in him, his eyes, dull with fatigue, sharpened with something else entirely. "Ethan," he whispered. Leo, still curled up at Daniel's side, lifted his head, ears twitching at the name. Amelia hesitated for only a moment before moving closer. She reached out, carefully placing Ethan in the crook of Daniel's arm, adjusting the blanket so that the infant was nestled securely against his father's chest. Daniel's breath caught audibly, his body going completely still as he stared down at his son. His fingers trembled as he lifted them, barely grazing the soft skin of Ethan's cheek, as though afraid the moment would shatter if he moved too fast. The hospital room seemed to disappear around them, the beeping monitors fading into nothing. It was just a father and his son, finally together after weeks of separation neither of them could have controlled. Amelia felt the sting of tears in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay quiet, to give Daniel this moment. "He's so small," Daniel murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Amelia smiled softly. "He's strong," she said, "just like his dad." Daniel let out a shaky exhale, his fingers brushing over the tiny hand that twitched against his chest. And then, as if drawn by instinct, as if tethered by something unseen, Ethan moved. His tiny fingers curled, grasping onto Daniel's thumb, the contact sending a visible shudder through Daniel's entire body. Leo let out a low whine, pressing his head closer against Daniel's side, his tail giving the faintest wag. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, swallowing hard, his jaw tightening against the emotions threatening to spill over. When he opened them again, his gaze met Amelia's. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw. She shook her head. "Don't thank me," she whispered. "Thank him." Daniel turned his head slightly, looking down at the dog that had somehow changed everything. He reached his free hand out, resting it atop Leo's head. "You never gave up, did you?" Leo huffed softly in response, his tail wagging a little harder now, his entire body radiating warmth and loyalty. Amelia felt something shift in the room then, something deep and profound. This was more than recovery. This was healing. And it wasn't just for Daniel. It was for all of them. She cleared her throat gently. "I should give you some time," she said, stepping back toward the door. Daniel didn't look away from his son. "Stay," he murmured. "Please." The plea caught her off guard, but she nodded, her heart swelling in her chest as she settled into the chair by the bed. The world outside the hospital would continue on, filled with medical explanations and news reports trying to make sense of the impossible. But here in this room, none of that mattered. A father had found his way back. A son had been given a chance. And a dog had proven that love, in its purest form, could bring people home. Morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft golden streaks across the room where Daniel lay, his son still cradled in his arms, his fingers never once letting go. The steady beeping of the monitors no longer felt ominous, but instead like a quiet rhythm of life. A reminder that against all odds, he was still here, still breathing, still holding on to the one thing that mattered most. The weight of the past few weeks had settled deep in his chest. The grief, the loss, but also something else, something lighter. Hope. Ethan stirred slightly against him, his tiny fingers twitching, his fragile form rising and falling with each breath. And Daniel let himself sink into the moment, let himself believe that somehow, despite everything, he had been given this second chance. Leo, ever present, still rested against his side, his large amber eyes half-lidded, ears twitching as if listening to the unspoken words between them. The dog had always been like that, understanding things no one else could, feeling things before they happened, moving with an intuition that defied explanation. Daniel turned his head slightly, resting his hand on the thick fur behind Leo's ears, stroking absently as he let himself take in the sheer impossibility of the past 12 hours. He had been trapped in darkness for so long, drifting in a world of nothingness, until he had felt something pull him back, something warm, something familiar. And then he had heard it, Leo's low, steady whine, a sound that had anchored him, had reminded him that he wasn't alone, that he had never been alone. The door to the room cracked open, and Amelia stepped inside, her eyes flickering between the father and son before landing on Leo, a soft smile playing at her lips. "How are you feeling?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Daniel exhaled, his grip tightening slightly around Ethan's small form. "Like I just woke up in a life I thought I lost," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. Amelia nodded, moving quietly to check the monitors, her presence calm, steady. "Your vitals are strong," she said. "Honestly, it's nothing short of a miracle." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "Both yours and Ethan's." Daniel glanced down at his son, his heart squeezing painfully in his chest. "I should have been there for him," he murmured, "from the start." Amelia met his gaze then, something firm and certain in her expression. "You're here now," she said, "and that's what matters." Leo let out a small huff, his tail thumping once against the hospital floor, as if agreeing. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Dr. Lucas stepped in, a tablet in hand, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Daniel. "Well," he said, sighing, "I don't even know where to begin with this one." He flipped the tablet around, showing Daniel a series of scans, charts filled with numbers and readings that, if he had the energy to focus, would probably tell him something about his miraculous recovery. "By all accounts, you shouldn't be this alert this fast," Lucas continued. "Patients who have been in a coma for nearly a month don't just wake up like this, with cognitive function fully intact, memory stable, motor skills returning." He shot a pointed look at Leo. "But then again, dogs don't usually break into hospitals and bring people back from the edge of death either." Daniel smirked weakly. "Leo's never been much for rules." Lucas shook his head, muttering something about medical anomalies before closing the tablet. "I'd normally want to keep you here for a long list of tests, but considering your son is also showing signs of rapid improvement, I'd say whatever's happening here is beyond what I can explain. We'll monitor you both, of course, but—" He hesitated, then shrugged. "You should be able to go home in a few days." Daniel let out a slow breath, the words sinking in. Home. The word felt foreign, almost untouchable. His home had been filled with laughter once, with the warmth of his wife's voice, with dreams of the future they were supposed to have. Now it would be just him and Ethan. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest, but then he felt the warm press of fur against his arm, the gentle rise and fall of the dog that had never left him. Not just him and Ethan. Leo was here. Leo had always been here. Amelia lingered by the doorway as Lucas left, her arms crossed over her chest as she studied Daniel. "What will you do now?" she asked gently. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the baby in his arms, then on the dog at his side. I don't know, he admitted, but whatever it is, I won't do it alone. A few days later, when Daniel was discharged, the hospital lobby was quieter than expected, but Amelia knew the reason. Word had spread quickly about the officer who had woken from his coma, about the baby who had survived against impossible odds, about the dog who had defied everything to make it happen. Outside the hospital, the morning air was crisp, the sky painted in soft streaks of pink and gold as the sun began its ascent. A small group of officers waited near the entrance, Daniel's old colleagues, their expressions filled with a mix of relief and awe as they watched him walk out, his son bundled securely in his arms, Leo trotting loyally at his side. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward, clapping a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We thought we lost you, Carter," he said gruffly. Daniel met his gaze, his grip tightening on Ethan. "So did I." There was nothing more to say, nothing that could properly explain the enormity of what had happened. So instead, Daniel nodded, then turned to the waiting car, where a car seat had already been placed, ready for Ethan's first ride home. As he settled his son carefully into the seat, buckling him in with a gentleness that spoke of a love too big for words, Leo jumped into the passenger side, his ears flicking as he watched Daniel with quiet understanding. Amelia stood nearby, watching as Daniel straightened, his eyes lingering on her for a moment. "I don't know how to thank you," he admitted. She smiled softly. "You don't have to." He hesitated, then reached out, squeezing her hand briefly. Then with one last nod, he climbed into the car, Leo sitting proudly beside him. As the engine started, as Daniel pulled away from the hospital and toward a new beginning, Amelia watched them go, her chest tight with something unnameable, because she knew, deep in her bones, that this wasn't just a story of survival. This was a story of love, of loyalty, of the kind of bond that transcended explanation. And in the end, it wasn't medicine or science that had saved them, it was Leo. This story is a powerful reminder that love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals can transcend even the most impossible odds. Leo's devotion to Daniel and Ethan wasn't just instinct. It was a testament to the depth of connection that exists between those who truly care for one another. Science and medicine may not always have the answers, but sometimes faith, hope, and the presence of a loved one, whether human or animal, can spark miracles in ways we can't fully explain. Through Leo's determination, we see that love never gives up, and sometimes the ones who save us aren't doctors or machines, but those who refuse to leave our side when we need them most. This story teaches us to cherish the bonds we share, to hold on to hope even in our darkest moments, and to never underestimate the power of a loyal heart. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and heartfelt stories. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you in the next video.